afternoon in the summer of 1938, something happened on a quiet block in Harlem that most people barely noticed at the time. There was no riot, no public confrontation, no immediate retaliation, just a single act carried out in broad daylight, followed by silence. And yet, within 3 days, the balance of power between an entire neighborhood and the police quietly shifted. This is not a story about revenge. It is not a story about pride or rage. It is a story about patience, about control, and about how pressure, applied the right way, can bend even the most rigid systems. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the exact moment it began. The day it started. August 17, 1938, West 126th Street, Harlem, just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The heat was heavy, pressing down on the street, the kind of heat that made the pavement soft and slowed everyone's movements. People sat on stoops, talked through open windows, and lingered in doorways to avoid the sun. Mabel Johnson, 23 years old, was walking home with a small bag of groceries. She lived nearby. This was part of her daily routine. She never made it home uninterrupted. A police officer stepped into her path. His name was Patrick Callahan. He had been assigned to Harlem for several years and carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed his authority would never be questioned. He stood close enough that Mabel could smell coffee on his breath. He asked her where she was going, not as a real question, but as a test. Mabel answered quietly. She said she was going home. She tried to move past him. He blocked her again. Then came the moment that changed everything. In front of dozens of witnesses, shop owners, men playing games on the sidewalk, women watching from their steps, an elderly man leaning out of a window, the officer struck her across the face. The grocery bag fell. Fruit rolled into the street. A jar shattered against the curb. The sound cut through the block. And then, nothing. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. No one interfered. Mabel stood still, stunned, with a visible mark on her cheek. The officer smiled, satisfied, and told her to clean up and leave. She did exactly that. Within minutes, the street returned to its usual rhythm, but Harlem had taken notice. The message reaches Bumpy Johnson. Less than 10 minutes later, a man named Tommy Reed pushed open the back door of the Cotton Club. He moved fast, straight towards a corner table where Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat under a single hanging light. Bumpy was reading the newspaper. A glass sat untouched beside him. Tommy stopped a few steps away and said there was a problem. Bumpy didn't look up at first. Only when Tommy mentioned Mabel did Bumpy raise his eyes. The story came out quickly. Where it happened, who did it, who saw it. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Tommy finished, Bumpy folded the newspaper slowly and set it aside. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He didn't ask for immediate action. He asked one question: which precinct? Then he wrote the officer's name down. After that, he said only 2 words: 72 hours. Tommy understood exactly what that meant. It was not a threat. It was a timetable. A different kind of response. Bumpy Johnson was known for many things, but impulsive violence was not one of them. He understood something most people didn't. Force attracts attention. Attention brings consequences. But absence of cooperation, creates chaos without fingerprints. That evening, Bumpy gave clear instructions. No one was to touch the officer. No one was to threaten him. No confrontations, no warnings. Instead, Bumpy wanted information. Who the officer drank with, who covered his shifts, who protected him when problems arose,
who owed money, who bent rules. By midnight, names were being collected, not to destroy the officer directly, but to remove the invisible supports holding him up. Harlem hears the story. By nightfall, the story had spread across Harlem. It moved through barber shops, card rooms, backdoor clubs, and apartment hallways. Each retelling sharpened the details. The silence after the slap became longer. The witnesses became more numerous. The meaning became clearer. Everyone understood something important. This was not just about one woman. This was about what happened when authority crossed a line in public and assumed there would be no consequence. In a basement card game, a police sergeant quietly asked if Bumpy Johnson was going to retaliate. The dealer answered calmly, "He doesn't retaliate, he educates." The message landed. Behind closed doors. The following night, a folder landed on Bumpy's kitchen table. Inside were schedules, habits, debts, and relationships. The officer in question owed money to multiple people. He relied on a superior to smooth over problems. That superior had secrets of his own. This wasn't coincidence. This was leverage. Bumpy made his first move without ever being seen. An anonymous report reached Internal Affairs, detailed enough to demand attention. Pressure began to build, not on the officer directly, but on the man who protected him. The shield was weakening. The silent boycott. Then Harlem made its move. No announcements, no meetings, no public calls to action. It happened naturally. Witnesses stopped seeing. Informants stopped hearing. Phones rang longer. Files went missing. The police weren't attacked. They were simply left alone. A burglary report yielded no useful descriptions. A violent incident produced no clear memories. Victims insisted nothing happened. Officers grew frustrated, not because crime had increased, but because their ability to control it had vanished. And at the center of it all stood one officer, increasingly isolated. The pressure builds. By the second day, the officer noticed something was wrong. Colleagues avoided him. People crossed the street when they saw him coming. Bar owners stopped serving him. Backup arrived slower. Reports stalled. The neighborhood had turned cold, not openly hostile, but unreachable. This was not fear. This was unity. And unity, when paired with silence, is powerful. The final understanding. By the third day, the message was clear. No threats were needed. No demands were spoken aloud. The officer went to his captain and requested a transfer. He didn't frame it as fear. He framed it as necessity. And the captain agreed. Because leadership understands something simple. An officer who cannot operate effectively is a liability. Within 72 hours, the problem removed itself. Why this moment mattered. Nothing was written down, no official statement was made, no apology was issued, but Harlem learned something lasting. Power does not require force. Sometimes it requires restraint. Sometimes it requires patience. And sometimes the strongest message is delivered without raising a hand. Closing. That afternoon in 1938 is remembered not because of what happened immediately, but because of what didn't happen. No explosion, no public revenge, no chaos, just a quiet lesson that echoed for years. One slap had rewritten the rules, and silence was the one that did the work.
When silence becomes a weapon. The official report was simple. She slipped. She fell down a flight of stairs. End of story. That was the explanation given when questions started coming in. And the explanation stuck because no one challenged it.
Later that day, Sergeant Murphy sat alone in the precinct break room, staring into a cup of coffee that tasted as bad as it smelled. When Officer Callahan walked in and poured himself a cup, Murphy didn't even glance his way. Callahan noticed. He made a joke, asked what was wrong, tried to sound casual. Murphy finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Did you put your hands on someone yesterday?" he asked. "Someone whose family controls half of Harlem." Callahan laughed it off. He brushed it aside as if it were nothing. Said the woman needed discipline. Said he showed her who was in charge. Murphy set his cup down slowly. "That wasn't the end," he said. "That was the beginning." Callahan's faded. Murphy stood up and walked toward the door. "Harlem just stopped working for us," he said over his shoulder. "No witnesses, no cooperation, no help. And it started minutes after what you did. Every officer in this building knows it, and now they're stuck cleaning up your mess." Callahan didn't respond. He didn't understand yet. The message holds. That same evening, inside the Cotton Club, everything looked normal on the surface. Music played softly, drinks were poured, men talked in low voices. Bumpy Johnson sat at his usual table, reading yesterday's newspaper again, not because he needed the information, but because it gave him something to do while he waited. Nearby, his associates stayed quiet. No one rushed, no one panicked. Then a shop owner named Jerome hurried inside, sweating, clearly nervous. He explained that police officers had visited his store. They asked questions about a break-in. They hinted that forgetting details might cause trouble. Bumpy folded his paper and finally looked up. "Let them come back," he said calmly. "Tell them you don't remember. Say the light was poor. Say whatever you need, but don't help them." Jerome asked how long this would last. Bumpy lifted his cup. 72 hours. After that, the problem solves itself. Jerome hesitated and asked the question everyone was thinking. "You're not going to hurt him, are you?" Bumpy took a sip and shook his head. "No," he said, "the system will do that on its own." Pressure spreads upward. That afternoon, a major shipment tied to organized crime was unexpectedly stopped at the bridge. No warning, no inside help, no favors. The people who usually smoothed things over simply weren't there. By evening, a powerful figure from downtown called Bumpy directly. His tone was tight, frustrated. Business had stalled. Money was being lost. Bumpy explained it plainly. "This isn't about profit," he said. "It's about lines that don't get crossed. When someone abuses power in public, Harlem shuts down. Nobody benefits until it's corrected." He gave a clear deadline. By Friday evening, the officer would be gone, or Harlem would no longer be worth doing business in. The call ended without goodbyes. Bumpy knew what would happen next. When money stops flowing, patience disappears. Harlem goes quiet. Over the next day, the neighborhood pulled back completely. Card games ended early. Nightclubs closed before midnight. Taxis parked and stayed parked. The streets grew quiet. Information stopped moving. The police weren't attacked. They weren't threatened. They were ignored. Calls went unanswered. Addresses were confused. Response times stretched longer and longer. By Thursday morning, arrests had dropped sharply. Downtown offices started calling the precinct captain, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Inside the precinct, Captain Reynolds sat behind his desk, buried in reports that made no sense. Cases falling apart, evidence missing, witnesses refusing to speak. He called Sergeant Murphy into his office and shut the door hard. "This isn't coincidence. This is organized. Someone is doing this on purpose." Murphy stood straight, hands behind him. "Who would do that, sir?" he asked evenly. Reynolds didn't answer right away.
Then he said the name out loud, Bumpy Johnson. He walked to the window and stared down at Harlem below, realizing something had shifted. The neighborhood wasn't angry, it was unified, and unity, he understood, was far more dangerous than chaos. The system begins to break. Court cases collapsed because paperwork didn't line up. Evidence logs didn't match. Witness statements vanished. Defense attorneys noticed immediately. Motions were filed. Charges were dropped. Defendants walked free. No rules were broken. No laws were violated. But the machine stopped working. Captain Reynolds felt pressure from every direction. Political offices, city leadership, business interests, all asking the same question: when does this end? The realization. By Friday morning, Callahan finally understood. His backup arrived late. Colleagues avoided him. Superiors watched him closely. He wasn't protected anymore. The system he relied on had quietly stepped away, and for the first time, he felt alone. The end without drama. No arrests were made, no public apology was issued, no headlines were printed, but by Friday evening, paperwork was filed, a transfer request approved. Callahan was moved out of Harlem, and just like that, cooperation slowly returned. Witnesses remembered again, phones got answered, the system restarted. Why this moment lasted? Nothing violent happened. That's why it worked. The lesson was simple and unforgettable. Power doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from patience, from restraint, from knowing when to stop holding the structure up and letting it collapse under its own weight. In Harlem, in 1938, one silent response changed the rules, and everyone who lived there remembered it.
Captain Reynolds grabbed the phone and didn't bother lowering his voice. "Bring Callahan to my office, now, and find someone who can reach Bumpy Johnson. This stops today. Otherwise, Callahan will be directing traffic on the far edge of the city tomorrow." At the Cotton Club. Across Harlem, inside the Cotton Club, Bumpy sat at his table with a drink in front of him. He hadn't touched it in a long time. He wasn't distracted. He was waiting. Ray came in and gave a quick nod. "Word is the captain is hunting for Callahan," Ray said. "He wants to talk to you. He's looking for a way to settle this." Bumpy lifted the glass, turned it slightly, watched the light move through the liquid. "No settlement," he said calmly. "Callahan leaves Harlem, or this continues until their station can't function." Ray leaned back. "They could bring in outside forces," he warned. "Extra manpower, maybe even military support." Bumpy gave a small smile, not a friendly one, more like someone who had already mapped every move on the board. "Let them try," he said. "Outside forces can't run a neighborhood without local cooperation. They need people to talk. They need directions. They need tips. They need guides. If Harlem refuses to help, all that extra manpower becomes useless." Ray studied him for a moment. "You're putting everything on this." Bumpy finally took a drink and set the empty glass down gently. "I'm not gambling," he said. "I'm teaching." He paused, then continued, voice steady and controlled. "I'm teaching the department there are boundaries. I'm teaching every officer in this city that Harlem isn't a place where someone can abuse people in public and walk away smiling. Callahan crossed a line. Now he pays, and everyone watching learns what it costs."
No one hit him. No one threatened him. No one raised their voice. But those hours taught him something a fight never could. He was alone. The structure that should have protected him had quietly stepped away. And somewhere across Harlem, Bumpy was watching the clock, knowing the lesson was landing exactly as planned. The last night in Harlem. Callahan spent that night in his apartment, staring at the ceiling. Every sound in the hallway felt louder than it should. Every car door outside made his body tense. He didn't sleep. Not because something happened, but because he couldn't stop imagining what could happen. And imagination, under pressure, can do more damage than any visible confrontation. Friday morning, the deadline hits. At 6 a.m., Captain Reynolds summoned him. Callahan walked through the precinct and felt it again. The silence, the sideways glances, conversation stopping when he passed. He wasn't just disliked, he was toxic. Reynolds sat behind his desk with a folder open, reading as if the information inside was painful. "Sit down," Reynolds said. Callahan sat. Reynolds closed the folder and finally met his eyes. "You're being transferred," he said. "Effective immediately. Staten Island, Traffic Division. Report Monday." Callahan froze. "Traffic?" he said. "That's a demotion. I didn't do anything wrong." Reynolds leaned forward. His voice dropped, quiet but sharp. "You put your hands on a woman in public. 30 people saw it. That woman is Bumpy Johnson's sister." Reynolds continued without raising his voice. "For 3 days, this precinct has been crippled. Cooperation vanished. Cases collapsed. Downtown is furious. Outside interests are furious. And every call, every report, every problem points back to you." Callahan stood. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're letting criminals decide policy." Reynolds stood too and stepped closer, close enough that Callahan could smell coffee again, just like that day on the street. "No," Reynolds said. "I'm preventing a situation we can't control." He held Callahan's stare. "You thought the badge made you untouchable. Harlem just proved it doesn't. Now clear your desk, take the transfer, and hope the neighborhood considers this settled." The clock stops and life returns. At the Cotton Club, Tommy arrived with news. "It's done," Tommy said. "Callahan's being moved out. Staten Island, Traffic Division." Bumpy folded his newspaper carefully. "Good," he said. "Send word. Cooperation resumes. Everything returns to normal." Tommy hesitated. "And if he tries to fight it?" Bumpy lifted his cup, cold now, and drank anyway. "He won't," he said. "He felt what it's like when the system turns on you. He spent one night imagining what could happen next. People who understand fear don't argue. They leave." By midday, the neighborhood behaved like the last 3 days never happened. Witnesses began speaking again. Files reappeared. Addresses were suddenly correct. Arrests returned to normal. Shipments moved again. Money flowed again. And Officer Callahan packed his things and left the precinct quietly, because no one wanted to be seen standing next to him. The official story versus the real one. Official paperwork described it as a routine transfer, nothing more. No mention of Mabel, no mention of the slap, no mention of the 3-day shutdown. But everyone who was there remembered the real story. A community showed what unity can do, and Bumpy Johnson delivered a lesson without throwing a punch, without making a public threat, and without leaving a single clean target for the system to strike back. Because you can't arrest silence, and you can't prosecute people for simply choosing not to cooperate. That's what those 72 hours proved. And the city quietly rewrote the story afterward, not because it was accurate, but because it was safer. What Harlem never forgot. The official record erased the cause and kept only the result. Paperwork described the outcome using safe words like fatigue, staffing needs, and administrative judgment. There was no mention of a public incident, no mention of a young woman, no mention of a boundary crossed. But Harlem remembered the truth, not the version typed into city files, the real one.
The story moved quietly from one generation to another, from fathers to sons, from bartenders to customers, from street corners to barber shops. Each retelling sharpened the lesson until it became something larger than a rumor. Nobody argued about the sequence. A public insult.
A public insult. Then silence. 72 hours. A transfer. Simple enough that even new officers understood it when they were assigned to Harlem years later. Veterans would pull them aside and explain the rules without raising their voices. You greet people with respect. You keep your hands to yourself. You do not confuse authority with permission. Because the last officer who made that mistake didn't disappear. He was quietly removed and never trusted again. The numbers spoke louder than words. The city never officially acknowledged what caused the change, but the data told its own story. In the year following August 1938, reported physical confrontations involving officers in Harlem dropped sharply. Complaints that once piled up and went nowhere stopped arriving, not because people were silenced, but because the behavior stopped happening. By the mid-1940s, it was rare for an officer to disrespect a woman in central Harlem without clear cause and witnesses present. The rule had become so deeply ingrained that no one needed to explain it. You respected the neighborhood, or you became ineffective inside it. Simple as that. The man who never claimed credit. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about what happened. When asked, he smiled, changed the subject, and let the quiet do the work. That silence allowed the story to grow, to evolve into warning, into myth, into a lesson every officer eventually learned without ever seeing it written down. He didn't need speeches. The absence of chaos was proof enough. Years later, at a card table, a young man once asked an older local how Bumpy controlled Harlem without armies or intimidation. The answer was immediate. He doesn't need force, the man said. He has memory. He has people who remember what happens when lines are crossed. You can't arrest that. You can't argue with it. You either respect it or you lose. The end of two legacies. When Bumpy Johnson passed away in 1968, thousands filled the streets for his funeral. Police officers managed traffic calmly, respectfully, in a way that would have been unthinkable decades earlier. Newspapers noted his criminal history, but also acknowledged the stability he helped maintain during turbulent times. Patrick Callahan's ending was quieter. He retired years later, remembered not for accomplishments, but as an example used in training rooms and quiet warnings. His name survived only as a lesson. A badge is not a shield from consequences. The lesson that lasted. Decades later, a father once walked his son past West 126th Street and pointed to the spot. "Something happened here," he said. The boy asked what. The father smiled. "Nothing for 3 days, then everything changed." And that was the lesson. Power isn't about striking first. Power is about making sure no one wants to strike at all. Harlem didn't remember shouting. It didn't remember threats. It remembered silence. A silence that spread, slowed systems down, and forced accountability without breaking laws or leaving evidence. That silence became a model, a strategy, a form of protection passed down quietly, generation after generation. Real power doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers.
And when tens of thousands whisper the same truth at the same time, it becomes impossible to ignore. Final note. This story is shared for historical reflection, not to promote harm, conflict, or illegal behavior. If this story resonated with you, if you saw the deeper lesson about accountability, restraint, and collective action, consider subscribing. These stories take time to research and craft. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Stories about power used wisely. Stories about consequences faced honestly. Stories about changing systems, not just destroying enemies. Until next time, remember, real power isn't what you can destroy, it's what you can stop without lifting a hand.